Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and thank you for joining this Jscrambler webinar. Today we're going to be talking about Iframe Integrity and empowering PSPs to secure payment iframes against skimming attacks with zero hassle. So just to give you a quick overview of what we'll be doing in this webinar, we expect the webinar to take around about 60 minutes. Around about 40 minutes of that will be presentations by myself and with Pedro. And then at the end of that, we've got somewhere in the region of about 15 to 20 minutes for any questions that you have. There is a questions section. You should see a little button in the bottom right, I believe, and you can pop your questions in there. And then Pedro and I will do our best to answer those at the end. And then after the webinar, everyone who's on the webinar here today will get an email with the recording of the webinar, as well as some additional information about Iframe Integrity. So just to introduce ourselves, I'm joined here today by Pedro Fortuna, CTO and co-founder at Jscrambler, and I'm Gareth Bowker. I'm a PCI technical advisor at Jscrambler.
Hello, everyone.
So today we'll start off, I will be talking about security and compliance challenges of protecting payment iframes. I will then hand over to Pedro, who'll be unveiling Iframe Integrity and talking about how this is a strategic advantage for PSPs. And as I mentioned, we'll have time at the end for a Q&A. So let's begin. So I just want to start by describing from a PCI perspective how we got to where we are. So over the past decade or so, maybe a little longer, there's been a big shift in the type of payment card fraud that's been occurring. So going back then, attackers would often target physical cards with physical skimming attacks, affecting ATM machines, petrol or gas pumps, payment terminals, and so on. They'd capture track data off the mag stripe, write this onto a new card, and then use that card to commit fraud. But at the same time, there was quite a big shift going on in the industry, moving to EMV cards, or chip and pin cards, as we tend to call them in Europe. And this chip made it practically impossible to copy the chip portion of the card. And so merchants began to rely and use only the chip. The card-present fraud rates basically fell off a cliff. But attackers were already moving into the online space, they're already there, and this then became a much more fruitful target. So as the 2010s progressed, attackers shifted more and more into this space, attacking websites, attacking back-end databases, and so on. But merchants solved a lot of this by outsourcing their payments to payment service providers. And they would have the resources then to be able to protect their systems to a much better level. And so the attackers had to find new ways to capture data. If we now move forward to around about 2020 or so, skimming attacks were quickly becoming a big issue. And in fact, MasterCard was saying that in 2022, approximately 75% of the publicly disclosed breaches involved digital skimming in some way. So the growth in these attacks was huge. In 2021-22, digital skimming grew by nearly 130%. And then the following year, it grew by another 60%. And to give you some sense of the scale of this, the most recent numbers that I could find around breaches showed that last year, almost 270 million card records were stolen. And most of those were through some form of skimming attack. So obviously, the PCI Council and the payment brands haven't been standing still, far from it. They were seeing this data, they were seeing these shifts, and as part of the ongoing PCI DSS lifecycle, they introduced some new requirements to help prevent skimming attacks. So in March 2022, PCI DSS version 4 was released, and it included two new requirements, 643, 1161, to tackle web skimming attacks. And these were future dated to go into effect, from the beginning of this month, in fact. So these two new requirements covered the authorization, integrity, and justification for every JavaScript on the page, on the payment page. It included change and tamper detection mechanisms, including checks for changes to security impacting HTTP headers. It required alerting personnel if problems were found, as well as checks at least weekly or periodically for anyone doing a TRA, a targeted risk analysis. And large merchants generally, I would say, had the resources and the technical capability to manage this. And from what I've seen so far, they've taken to these requirements pretty well, all told. But for smaller and medium-sized merchants, we often see that they're struggling, particularly when they try to roll their own solution. So quite a lot we've seen will use things like CSP and SRI to try to tackle these requirements. So just to give a quick example here, this is jQuery. Many of you will probably have heard of jQuery or seen it or even used it. Around about 75% of the top 100,000 websites use jQuery in some way, shape or form. It's around about 70 kilobytes of, well, this. It's minified JavaScript here, and it can make it next to impossible to effectively review it manually. So going from one version of jQuery or any other library to the next, is it really possible for someone to review code in this form and be able to say what it does or what the changes are? Now, they could always look at the original source code where it's not been minified, but if they review that, they also need to be able to validate that the minified code matches and so on and so forth. It's definitely tricky to review this type of code manually, whether it's minified or not. And this is where behavior-based solutions, so Jscrambler's own web page integrity works on behavior. It can tell you what the code is actually doing. So it's observing the running scripts. So, what it's connecting to, which iframes or forms it's accessing or modifying, and so on. But it still needs people with the technical capability to manage all of this. And again, for larger entities, this is fairly straightforward. The uplift is fairly minimal. They've already got people who know what the code should be doing, and they can tell if it starts misbehaving. But if someone's trying to understand changes to code like this, for example, then, imagine that someone's reviewing this minified code, but then buried deep inside that code is just something like this. It looks fairly innocuous, but this is actually the second stage loader for a skimmer that Jscrambler published some research on just a couple of weeks ago. Trying to find this buried inside that 70K of code would be very difficult if it's done from a manual perspective. So the point here is to try to show that it's very difficult to keep on top of these types of things manually. But again, from the discussions that I've been having since PCI DSS version 4 came out, my understanding is that small and medium-sized merchants in particular were struggling with these requirements. And I know the PCI Council were hearing the same. That's because in January, they published an update. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with SAQA, but just in case you're not, SAQA is for merchants who fully outsource their payments to a third-party service provider or payment processor. And they take payments either by redirecting the customers straight to the TPSP, or more commonly by just running some JavaScript in their payment page provided by the TPSP, and it inserts some iframes into the page, into the checkout page to take the payment. So the changes to SAQA involved removing PCI DSS requirements 643 and 1161 from the SAQ. But at the same time, they added a new eligibility criterion. And at first glance, it looked a fair bit like a summary of what requirement 643 and 1161 did, just with different words. It's fair to say that there was a lot of confusion around this. What does not susceptible mean, and so on. There was discussion on LinkedIn, blog posts, and so on. And probably for about a month, almost every call that I was on involved discussing these SAQ changes with customers. And based on how many questions we were getting, I dread to think how many questions the PCI Council were getting. So 1 month later, the Council published FAQ 1588, and this was to try to clarify what they meant in SAQA. So reading the first bullet on the screen here, it pretty much says something like, do something like requirement 643 and 1161, and then you'll meet the eligibility criteria, which means you don't have to do requirement 643 and 1161. So it kind of sounds initially like a bit of a circular argument. However, it also has that little bit there where it says such as but not limited to. And that definitely increases the scope of how people can meet this eligibility criteria beyond what was just written in requirement 643 and 1161. But interestingly, in the second bullet, it talks about if the third-party service provider, the TPSP or the payment processor, includes techniques that protect the merchant's payment page from script attacks, then they meet the eligibility criteria. But what exactly is the merchant's payment page here? What is it that needs protecting? So there's kind of 3 different ways of implementing a payment page, or 4 if you include the full redirect to the TPSP. So the first one here is a form that's hosted on the merchant's payment page directly. It could post that data to the merchant's website. It could post that data directly to the third-party service provider. Either way, the form is directly on the merchant's website. It's a single page here. The second picture here shows an inline frame or an iframe. It's embedded on the merchant's payment page. Iframes are pretty clever because they allow you to pull elements in from different websites and show them just like any other part of the page. Except in this case, the web browser puts some level of protection between the parent page, which is the piece in magenta here, and the iframe payment page, which is in blue. And that protection is actually stronger where the iframe comes from a different domain, or to give it its proper name, the iframe is cross-origin. In this example, the merchant's payment page is magenta, and it actually isn't touching anything to do with the payment data at all. That's all being managed within the iframe, which is coming from the TPSP. And then the third example here is very, very similar to that second one. It's just that it's using a single iframe for each of those fields. So from an SAQA perspective, it's only those last 2 that may be eligible for SAQA. I say may be eligible because obviously there are other eligibility criteria that need to be met here too. And the merchant here would need to validate that they actually meet all of those eligibility criteria, of course. And the reason that these types of outsourced payment pages may be eligible for SAQA and the reduced number of requirements is because of that cross-origin security that I mentioned. It gives the web browser some level of security for protecting the payment elements on the page. Unfortunately, though, it's not quite that simple. Never is it? There are still several types of attack that an attacker can carry out on the merchant's parent page. That's the part that was in magenta, as I mentioned on the last slide. So there are things like iframe hijacking. So this is where a malicious script is running on the parent page, and it compromises the methods and the APIs that are used to create the payment iframe. And this causes the iframe to load a different URL. So that different URL is set and controlled by an attacker, and they can make it look to be essentially indistinguishable from the legitimate payment form. And then this could easily trick any unsuspecting customers to enter their payment details, which are then captured and stolen. Another risk here is iframe overlay. This is where a malicious script that's again on the parent page, it injects a payment iframe, fraudulent payment iframe into the parent page. This fake iframe is then positioned very, very carefully so that it overlays, it's directly on top of the real payment iframe. And this means that when people are entering their payment details, they're actually putting it into the overlaid fake form. So the data here could be collected from the parent window, or it could be submitted to an attacker-controlled server, but it's not going here to the legitimate payment provider. And this method's particularly dangerous because the genuine iframe is actually still in place. It still remains in place, and it makes the attack much harder to detect. Another risk is fake iframes. So this is very similar to the iframe overlay, but now rather than loading the legitimate payment page and then overlaying on top of it, they simply load a fake iframe. It loads before the legitimate payment page even loads, so it completely overrides that loading. People again are putting data into that fake iframe. It's then harvested by the attacker. And this one, we often see this in pop-ups or redirects that are meant to look a lot like part of the expected checkout process. And the last one here is function hijacking. And this is where a malicious script intercepts and manipulates the underlying JavaScript functions within the parent page again. And here they're now proxying for a trusted script. So the attacker can impersonate the execution of that script, leverage the script's permissions, and access sensitive data. And this allows the attacker to modify legitimate functions. They can exfiltrate data, they can execute unauthorized actions in the guise of that trusted script. And again, it makes detection particularly challenging here too. The point here is that there are still risks from the payment page, from the parent page here. And so there still needs to be some form of defense for that parent page. Attackers can still conduct silent skimming attacks or double entry attacks, even though using iframes can still help reduce the risk to merchants. It's much harder for attackers, but it's not impossible. And that's why merchants can't simply ignore the JavaScript on their site completely. Except, if we come back to FAQ 1588 again, we'll focus on that second bullet here. So this is where the third-party service provider or payment processor has techniques that protect the merchant's payment page from script attacks. Now, if you're a merchant listening to this and you've got an internal PSP, you'll probably want to focus on the part in the first bullet that talks about such as, but not limited to, the requirements in 643 and 1161. But the question ultimately is the same. How could a payment service provider or a payment processor protect the merchant's payment page from script attacks? So with that thought, I'd like to hand over now to Pedro to introduce Iframe Integrity. Pedro.
Thanks for that cliffhanger, Gareth. So to keep the audience anxiety levels in check, I'll just say upfront that the second bullet you just shown can be addressed by Iframe Integrity, which is the solution I'll be presenting next. But let's start with the beginning. I remember it was in mid-October 2023, and I was attending the PCI SSC community meeting in Dublin. And obviously, between presentations and panels, I found myself in a conversation with, I don't remember exactly with whom, but it was with QSAs and PSPs. And we were discussing one of the industry emerging challenges, which is how can small merchants, meaning level 3 and level 4, realistically comply with PCI DSS v4 new requirements 643 and 1161. So the problem was coming. It was obvious to some of us. So many of these smaller merchants, they lack the resources, the expertise, or even the interest to manage the complexity of script management and security monitoring. Yet the threat of skimming attacks was more present than ever, and it has only grown since. So as we were sharing our ideas and concerns over coffee, one question came up, which is, could payment service providers step in to help? Much like they did in earlier versions of PCI DSS with the introduction of the iframe payment page. Of course, maintaining script inventories and responding to alerts across thousands of merchants would be unmanageable for those PSPs. So we quickly started, drafting, dribbling a different approach to the problem. And this challenge became the seed for what would grow eventually into the iframe integrity. So at that moment, we had a pretty good intuition on the restrictions that the solution had to work with, and that became the design goals. So the number one was not requiring the cooperation from merchants. Obviously, this was the main problem we were trying to solve. So that meant no authorizations or justifications needed or could be required from the merchants. Even asking them to add a script would be problematic, given the potentially large number of these smaller merchants that would be covered by any single large PSP. Another design goal is that ideally the PSP should not need to do anything on a day-to-day basis unless something really problematic happens, like a major breach or something, which we wouldn't be an everyday event, hopefully. So that meant no manual validations, no responding to everyday mundane alerts, and everything that needs blocking needs to be blocked without any human intervention, especially the PSPs. And last but not least, the solution must be able to scale to hundreds of thousands of smaller merchants. We knew right away what it meant, that we would have to avoid merchant-specific configurations altogether. So if we had like the slightest need for introducing something merchant specific, that would blow out to thousands of different configurations needed to be created and maintained. So overall, the solution needed to be both performant, efficient, and also low maintenance. Since we can't expect merchants or PSPs to maintain script inventories or authorize scripts or justify those scripts, the solution needed a different approach. That's why we turned to a compensating control. And you might wonder, shouldn't this fall under the customized approach instead? And actually, no, because merchants completing the SAQA and not undergoing a ROC-based assessment aren't eligible to use the customized approach. So it needs to be a compensating control. So instead, we need to address all the risks posed by scripts running on the parent page of these merchants that could potentially lead to the skimming of the cardholder data. So any solution that we come up with must be able and capable of mitigating all of these threats. I have a few of them listed over there, essentially the same ones that Gareth presented already. I'll walk through a couple of these later to give you a deeper sense of how they work in just a moment. And at this stage, it became clear that we needed behavior-based monitoring via an agent, one that would effectively prevent the misbehaving of these malicious scripts running on the parent page and stop them from interfering with the payment iframe or from creating new iframes or forms that could potentially overlay the legitimate iframe. But to ensure scalability, the agents could not rely on sandboxing rules, as I said, that could be tailored to individual merchants. And as far as deploying the agent, rather than asking each merchant to add it to the parent page, we quickly envisioned that we could partner with the PSP to piggyback on their existing script. So all of these merchants, they're already using some PSP, sometimes even multiple. But the point is the PSP already has a script running on the parent page. So instead of just like rolling out, requesting all of these merchants to add one more script in there, which it would take forever for all of them to comply, we just leverage the fact that the PSP is already there and have this PSP script add the agent in with the Iframe Integrity configuration. And if you think about it, like that way it comes full circle. Like we're positioning the product, we're offering this product to the PSP, and this PSP alone and autonomously is able to add this configuration, this agent to the merchant's parent page, and automatically and seamlessly every merchant will benefit from the solution automatically. So let me walk you through a couple of these attacks to give you a clear understanding of both these attacks mechanics and also some intuition on how the mitigations work. In an iframe overlay attack, a compromised script creates a new iframe, as the example, the little snippet of code you see in the slide. And this overlays the iframe on top of the legitimate payment iframe. So this fake iframe is fully controlled by the attacker. In some situations, it could simply just capture the data by tricking the user into entering the data into the fake iframe, and then sends this data to an attacker-controlled server. In other variants of this attack, it could make this this iframe same origin, so that the compromised scripts can collect the data directly from inside that iframe and then just post that information to some place controlled by the attacker. Either way, the result is the same. The cardholder data is schemed, and all happens without the user noticing anything. So Iframe Integrity defends against this attack by monitoring which scripts attempt to create iframes or forms, if it's overlaying using a form element instead of an iframe, and then enforcing strict restrictions on that behavior. So by controlling what scripts can create iframes or forms, and in what ways they can control those iframes and forms, by attenuating what they can do, will limit the potential for other scripts, if they become compromised, to be able to overlay those scripts on top, or those elements on top of the payment iframe. One more thing about the iframe overlay is that any solution that will focus solely in monitoring the payment iframe would not be able to catch this type of activity, because if you think about it, it's actually not touching at all on the legitimate iframe. So this is a good example of a more holistic kind of behavior-based monitoring is needed to be able to to cover all sorts of variants of these types of iframe-based attacks, not just monitoring the specific payment iframe. Iframe hijacking is a bit different. Here, the attacker interferes with the payment iframe creation process, which means that the malicious code needs to run first. So you have an example in the slide. In this example, the compromised script is monkey patching the set attribute DOM method in a way that when called, when the set attribute is called using the attribute source of an iframe element, this new implementation of the DOM method will actually replace the destination address by one indicated by the attacker. So this first step, it's only the monkey patching of the DOM method, so nothing is happening at this stage. But later, when the PSP scripts is running, eventually it will call this method from their code. And what happens is that instead of just calling the default DOM implementation of this method, the malicious version of that method will be called instead. And what happens is that the iframe that shows up will point to a URL controlled by the attacker. Okay, so iframe integrity prevents this by rolling out iframe tamper prevention and detection that essentially stops this monkey patching from being successful. So we can detect whether these particular DOM methods were interfered with. We can prevent, in some situations, the tampering from even occurring, and we can detect this and make sure that the iframe created is not pointing to an attacker-controlled URL. I believe it's the third time that we're showing you this slide. So you get from here that this is a really important issue in all of this. So, but I'm using this slide to tell you that we actually had this Iframe integrity solution in place and running on a few customer sites for almost a year when the FAQ 1588 was published. Though it wasn't at the time an official product, and we were calling it a different name. We were calling it then the armored iframe. But then, like a year later, when FAQ 1588 was released, it clearly opened the door for TPSP provided solutions, that protected the merchant's web page from script-based attacks. So we saw this as a great opportunity for, pushing forward our solution. So we recently rebranded the armored iframe to Iframe Integrity and officially launched it as part of our product portfolio. And here it is, now part of our already extensive client-side protection platform, offering a seamless and scalable solution for PSPs to help smaller merchants meet requirements 643 and 1161, or to be SAQA eligible, which one you prefer. And it's a solution that significantly simplifies both the initial deployments and ongoing operational efforts, and I'll tell you more about it. So a bit more detail. The iframe integrity, as I mentioned, is deployed by integrating by a simple integration with the PSP build process. So essentially, the CI/CD that builds that PSP script needs to have one more step in there, where we essentially harden that PSP script to protect it against function hijacking, one of the other attacks mentioned by Gareth, but also to make that script add the iframe integrity specific agent to every merchant's parent page. So this is a build stage action. So it transforms the PSP, and then when this PSP is loaded, it's already hardened and it's already adding the iframe integrity specific agent. And then, as I described, the iframe integrity agent is loaded and it starts, shielding all the DOM methods responsible for the iframe creation or manipulation, and you gain, or merchants gain, iframe tamper detection and prevention, and it essentially it's sandbox the browser environment to prevent all dangerous behaviors that any script might initiate from interfering with the iframe, with the payment iframe, that could lead to the skimming of the cardholder data. And that's it. Essentially, it's a blocking by default kind of solution. So you don't have to respond to alerts. You don't have to analyze anything that happened. Essentially, it's in a way, you can see it as a least privilege kind of approach, where we are taking away some of the powers that any script would have on the parent page. Some of those behaviors would be actually risky to the the functionality of the payment iframe and to the data that the user is entering on that payment iframe. So let me quickly highlight the key benefits. So first, it makes PCI DSS v4 compliance and SAQA eligibility much easier for your merchants if you are a PSP, and because it removes the complexity, so no one needs to be there every day authorizing scripts, justifying them, looking at headers that changed, making sure that the inventories are up to date and all of that. No one needs to be doing that, but it does not compromise the risk reduction or mitigation that you get from the default approach of the 643 and 1161. Secondly, it offers enhanced protections against payment card data skimming and helps prevent data leakage. And thirdly, it's truly plug and play. So integration is smooth, is non-disruptive. It's a one-time thing that you get in there, and it just works through the PSP script right out the box, so you don't have to do anything. In fact, merchants don't even have to be fully aware that they are being protected. And as a bonus, this is my last slide, Iframe Integrity doesn't just strengthen the security of the payment, it actually also unlocks new business potential. PSPs can, for one, they can stand out from the competition, especially from the larger players, by offering what we say it's a truly differentiated and valuable service to their merchants. So that means, or could mean, that you have a stronger merchant retention, because now they are, enjoying this value added service out of the gate from the PSP. And on top of that, and optionally, it creates opportunities for new revenue streams, whether through premium pricing or upselling, or just offering a hassle-free PCI compliance add-on for merchants who just want it taken care of, which, it's very often the case. And that's it from my side.
Okay,
Gareth.
Pedro, you have a quick live demo coming in a second, don't you? So just
Yep.
whilst you're setting that up, just a reminder for people who are listening live, obviously all of you listening right now are live. We do have a Q&A in just a minute after the live demo. Right now I'm not seeing any questions that have come in yet, so if you do have any questions, anything that you'd like to ask about, please do look for the little questions button at the bottom of the window. You can post your questions in there, and then Pedro and I will do our best to answer them in just a minute.
All right, so let's see if this works. Hopefully you can see my screen all right. So what you will see is a fictitious merchant website called merchant.com. So I'll go through the two attack scenarios, iframe overlay and iframe hijacking, that I presented more thoroughly before. For each of them, I'll first show it working without the iframe integrity, and then with the iframe integrity, so you can spot the differences. So if I'll just make sure that I have your questions visible. So in case you want to make it more slightly more interactive, you can. Let me just put the chat here. All right. So I see we have a question already. I'll save that for after the demo, since it's not demo related, but if you have a demo specific question, I'll try to answer that as we go. All right, so this is the merchant's website. It has an iframe. So it's not compromised at the moment. It doesn't have the iframe integrity as well. You can see to the right my console. So it does not represent the merchant's server, nor the PSP server, not the attacker's server. It's just you will see some messages that could be either the the PSP or the PSP backend or the attacker's backend. So, but everything that it's important is to the left. So you'll see it to the left. So you can safely ignore what you're seeing to the right, but sometimes it could be helpful. All right, so let's just very quickly fill in the card details. This is a fictitious merchant, so I'll can just type anything. It will not actually validate this. These are valid card numbers, but as you can see, the payment received. Here's an iframe, and you can see in the back end of the PSP, we're getting the data normally. Now, let me jump to the unprotected version of the iframe overlay. So you'll see the same iframe, but now it's now overlaid with this reddish iframe. So it's not completely covering the green iframe. This is on purpose because this is an educational example. And here you can see what seems to be a console. It represents the console of the attacker. Okay, so let me show you exactly. You have here the page, and we can see the original, the payment iframe, which is now overlaid by the compromised iframe, which in this case is not pointing to any URL. It has the full HTML source docked in, and it actually will post the data back to the PSP step number 2 of the payment flow. So it tries to do an overlay attack, but also a silent skimming attack, where the user will only be asked once to type in the cardholder details. So let me show you. Since this is a source doc, the compromised iframe, it also means that it is same origin. And we have a script in here, overlay attack, which represents a third party that got compromised. Okay, this is the script that is creating the overlaid iframe. So I'll type in again, and before I submit, let me click here skim to prove that the compromised script running on the parent page is actually able to collect the data from this now same origin overlaid fake iframe. And I can, as I told you, submit. So it jumps to the real PSP flow. So the PSP receives the data as well, but the data was successfully schemed. Okay. Now let's see this another time, but now with the iframe integrity running. And in this case, the iframe integrity detected the behavior and prevented the iframe from being created successfully. So it blocked an iframe creation. And all we have right now is a single iframe, which is the legitimate iframe. Okay. So essentially that's it. If we fill in the details again, it will very much look like the first run that we did with no compromised scripts running. So the data is submitted to the PSP backend, and nothing happened, despite the fact that a compromised script is still potentially running on the website, but is not being able to do the iframe overlay attack. Now let's move on to the iframe hijacking. A first run without iframe integrity, and this iframe was hijacked, and let's see that. So instead of 2 iframes as the first example, you will see a single payment iframe, but it's now pointing to maliciousschema.com. Obviously, in a real world attack, you wouldn't see such an obvious domain name being used, But the point is the payment iframe is now completely in control of the attacker. So if we fill this in, the data would be submitted to the attacker maliciousschema.com. So not the PSP, but the malicious schemer. And as you can see here, the data was correctly received by the attacker. So now let's see the final run with the iframe integrity. And as you can see, the iframe hijacking was blocked. So the DOM, the monkey patching of the DOM method set attributes so the tampering was prevented, and you can see the agent here, and so the iframe is pointing to the expected URL, so nothing went wrong, and the normal user experience can proceed, and the payment is correctly received. And this is pretty much it. There are other attacks, as we mentioned, but I believe that these two are good educational examples of the types of attacks that we're talking about against iframes. The overlay is a type of attack that does not touch the original legitimate payment iframe at all, and the iframe hijacking thus attempt to tamper with the legitimate iframe. So it requires a number of different security controls enforced by the agent that has a non-merchant specific configuration that applies a least privilege principle in terms of what behaviors it allows from other scripts running in the parent page when the PSP script is creating the payment iframe and trying to secure the whole experience of getting cardholder data. I think this is it in terms of a demo. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to your questions. I see we already have one we can start with.
Yeah, we actually have two questions in total. So we've got the question from Daniela to begin with, which is how much integration effort would you expect?
Right. So the integration effort is a one-time thing and is not complicated. So presumably the PSP has a CI/CD to build their scripts. They may have one version of that PSP script. They have multiple versions of that PSP script, but essentially they have a streamlined CI/CD that builds that script or scripts, and they just add one step using a Jscrambler CLI tool with a preset configuration that does not need any tuning. So it's just one or two quick steps, add that in, and then that's it. Like we do the PSP JavaScript code transformation, so we do the hardening, and that gets done automatically using the preset configuration, and it will also add the agent in, piggybacking on that PSP script. So obviously we have that documentation fully ready for our customers, and whoever is interested in learning more about the details of that integration. But it's very similar to, if you are familiar with our code integrity product, which you might be, it's essentially the same thing. If you are not, then, as I said, it's just a matter of adding one step to your CI/CD build process. If you have if this wasn't helpful, just let me know in more detail, or in what aspects you want to dig deeper.
Thank you for that. So next question is, if my PSP delivers a protected iframe to my parent page, does that make me automatically PCI compliant? I think I'll take this one.
Yeah.
So the short answer here is no, it doesn't, but it does help. So the purpose of this really is to meet the eligibility criteria for SQA.
First of all, we have to clarify what it means to be PCI compliant.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's it. So this is about helping people meet the eligibility criteria for SAQA, and that would then mean that that they're meeting what is now replacing requirement 643 and 1161. There are other requirements that still need to be done as part of SAQA. More widely, for any merchant that isn't doing SAQA, maybe they're doing SAQ AEP or anything else like that, they could use this as a compensating control for requirement 643 and 1161 instead. But for those requirements, it absolutely does still help. And for anybody who'd be being assessed, for example, by a QSA, it would still need to be assessed, of course. So does it make you automatically PCI compliant? Absolutely not. But does it get you well on the road to that? Yes.
Right. And we can also add that there is, although the different QSAs might reach, might demand different things to make sure that you should be PCI DSS compliant. But we have been doing this for a year now, so we have multiple customers that actually have this in place and are PCI DSS compliant, and so they had no trouble to have this solution, well accepted by their QSAs and acquiring banks.
Along those lines as well, we should probably mention as part of this service offering, people have access to people like myself and to John Elliott and so on, who can help with any of those discussions with QSAs as well. So we're here not just to provide a product and help with the security side of it, but absolutely here to support on the whole compliance piece as well, and help with any questions that come in either from yourselves or from assessors.
Absolutely. Happy to discuss with QSAs, your QSAs or anyone that you trust. Also, I think it's worth mentioning that although when we say a PSP, we're actually simplifying. There are multiple types of TPSPs, and also very importantly, there are also merchants who have their own PSP, internal PSP. In those cases, you don't need to scale to thousands of brands or e-commerce systems. You're probably in the lower tens, but the solution still works and still does the job, and it can be delivered by the merchant's own PSP if they have one. So it's also a way to potentially simplify meeting with these two requirements, or being eligible with the SAQA new eligibility criteria. Obviously, for larger merchants, it's probably wise if they can meet the default approach of the 643.11.6.1, because it's, you know, it's fully predictable, and they get also other benefits like they should know what they are running on their website, so they have an inventory, they are monitoring, and they might have, you know, their own internal teams that might want to look at the scripts they are running and what they are doing there. There are other benefits beyond even like PCI DSS, like making sure that you don't have scripts mass collecting, you know, information from your website, be that payment data or just, you know, PII or other types of data that you might want to prevent. So the default approach of the 643.11.6.1 does offer those benefits, and most QSAs are already quite familiar with these controls. But it's also good to know that there are other approaches being used in the market that for perhaps merchants who do not have, you know, the size and resources and just want things, you know, simplified for them. It's nice to know that there are other approaches out there.
Yeah. So just looking at the clock here, I think we're rapidly running out of time. I'm not seeing anybody typing. So I think with that, I'll just wrap up quickly by just summarizing, you know, Iframe Integrity's benefits here. It's a solution aimed at third-party payment service providers, payment processors, large merchants with their own internal PSP, as Pedro was just talking about there. And it's hardening the payment iframe, so you can show that the payment iframe then includes techniques that protect the merchant's payment page from script attacks, tying it back to the FAQ that I mentioned, FAQ 1588. From a security perspective, it significantly raises the bar. It makes it much harder for attackers. And from a compliance perspective, TPSPs and payment processors can provide their merchant customers with a hassle-free, straightforward way to meet the new eligibility criteria in SAQA. If you are interested in finding out more, please do contact us to schedule a demo. Our email address is on the screen now, and you can find out more information on our website. So thank you very much for watching this webinar. And for those of you attending it live, just a reminder that we'll email you very shortly with a link to the recording of this webinar, as well as some more information about Iframe Integrity. We would love to hear your feedback about this webinar too, so please let us know what you thought. And with that, on behalf of Pedro and myself, thank you again for joining us. And we'd like to wish you a great rest of your day. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye-bye.